In 1975, socialite Ann Woodward's glittering world came to a grim end. One October day, her life ended. Questions about why flooded in, and the answer was truly shocking. Ann Woodward was supposed to get a fairy tale ending, going from working in seedy clubs to marrying America's most eligible bachelor and swanning about with Truman Capote. The beginning of her story was pure Cinderella fantasy. But one sudden and mysterious twist sent the socialite down a dark path, one that ended in blood, betrayal, and her own ghastly death. From the beginning, all Ann Woodward wanted was to be important. Although born Evangeline Crowell in 1915 in small-town Kansas, by the time she was 23 she'd moved to New York City, changed her name to Ann Eden, and was trading in her already gorgeous looks to work as a model with the influential John Robert Powers agency. By the late 1930s, Ann had become a sought-after radio actress and even had a role in Noel Coward's Set to Music. With her glossy hair, big eyes and plump lips, her beauty was enough for listeners to give her the somewhat paradoxical title of the most beautiful girl in radio. Although Ann saw some success in her early years in New York, it was also a grind to keep any of that success going. In her mid-20s, she was mostly working as a showgirl for Fifi's Monte Carlo, a nightclub that serviced the rich and powerful men of the city. While working one day, Ann had a date with destiny. The wealthy banker William Woodward Sr. walked in. Woodward wasn't just rich, he came from an old money family that demanded respect everywhere they went. According to some accounts, Ann jumped at the opportunity and became his mistress. If that's true though, it makes her next move downright shameless. Ann soon met Woodward's only son and heir, the 22-year-old William Billy Woodward Jr., and if you believe the most depraved rumours, it was the Woodward patriarch who, after some test runs, passed Ann onto his son like a deranged gift. As the only son, Billy was the pride and joy of his family, and especially of his domineering, immaculate mother, Elizabeth Crider. When Ann met him, the young Billy was valiantly serving in the Navy and had earned a Purple Heart for his bravery in World War II, so almost no one thought she was good enough for him. His mother wasted no time labelling Ann as a gold digger and urged her son to dump her. Driven on by the excitement of his mother's disapproval, Billy married Ann in the early 1940s. New York high society was notoriously unfriendly to anyone it didn't already know, and poor Ann got completely shunned from the best parties from the moment she said, "I do." If New York society thought they could break the new Mrs. Woodward, they soon realised how wrong they were. Ann waited them out, all the while learning the manners, fashions and references she needed to circulate even the chilliest rooms. It also helped that she gave Billy 2 sons and heirs, Woody and Jimmy, in quick succession. Before long, Ann got into the in crowd of New York City. She was also in a pit of rattlesnakes. Ann's late 1940s New York was a who's who of socialites, and the top among them were the swans, a term the writer Truman Capote, himself a fashionable figure, used to describe his leggy, coiffed inner circle of it girls like Babe Paley, Gloria Guinness and Slim Keith, among others. These women graced the sidewalks like they were catwalks, and now Ann Woodward was walking among them. By the end of the 1940s, Ann's life was rotting from the inside out. While she and Billy had begun passionate and defiant, by now their relationship had devolved into petty fighting. Most embarrassingly, many of these fights happened in public, in full view of the other well-to-do guests. Behind closed doors, Ann Woodward and Billy were very rarely with each other. Indeed, most of their marriage was marked by a string of affairs on either side, which only served to stoke their jealousies and insecurities and make them fight even more. Eventually, Billy felt he only had one choice. In truth, despite their many galas and society events, the Woodwards didn't even make it out of the 1940s before Billy told Ann he wanted a divorce. Even with the private pains of her marriage, Ann didn't think she could face the end of her reign of New York, nor give up her social status. She refused his request. Ann may have clung to her prestigious husband, but that didn't mean it was good for her. Between the constant arguments, cheating, and utter loneliness, it was ultimately too much to handle. Soon she was drowning her sorrows not just in well-made martinis, but also prescription pills. Around Halloween in 1955, Ann and Billy, still limping along in their marriage, were about to attend a party hosted by their close personal friends, the Duke of Windsor and his wife, Wallis Simpson. While at dinner, guests overheard the couple say something prophetic. The pair of them were discussing the string of burglaries that had recently taken place in their neighbourhood. Then they revealed the most chilling part. In the midst of the conversation, Billy confessed that he kept a gun by his bedside table. Then, as if that weren't enough, Ann, who had long been sleeping in a separate room from Billy, revealed that she kept one too, right beside her bed. And yes, this became extremely tragic foreshadowing. After heading back from the Duke of Windsor's place, Ann and Billy retired to their respective rooms. Ann woke up in horror. Her dog was barking up a storm, and she knew what it meant. The burglar was in their house. A moment later, she claimed she heard a noise on the roof. Alarmed, Ann grabbed the shotgun that was by her bed and walked around the house in search of the intruder. Then she saw him, and he was right in front of Billy's door. Without wasting a moment, Ann held up the weapon and shot. At 2:35 a.m, the authorities arrived at the house unsure what they were going to see upon entering. The image was bloody and tragic. Ann was cradling her husband's lifeless body, sobbing and crying, "I did it." The man in front of the door was no burglar, it was Billy himself. Whatever Ann claimed her reasons were, the cold hard truth was that she had killed her husband. But in the swirling heady hours after the apparent accident, an unsettling sign pointed in another direction. After calling the authorities and the ambulance, Ann then had the wherewithal to call her high-powered lawyer, Saul Rosenblatt. At Rosenblatt's urging, the authorities took her to a hospital in Manhattan where medics had to sedate her in order to calm her down. In the end, officers only formally questioned Ann a full 48 hours after Billy's demise. When the press found out, they went wild. This clearly biased treatment of one of the shining stars of Manhattan wasn't just infuriating to them, it seemed clear evidence of her true guilt. Life magazine immediately dubbed it the shooting of the century. A few days later, though, shocking new evidence appeared in the case. Right around the time officers questioned Ann, they collared a man named Paul Worths, a man who not only had a history of burglary, but who also claimed that he'd been trying to break into the Woodward house just as the shots rang out. For some onlookers, it seemed to exonerate Ann. For someone very close to home, it made things much worse. Ann's mother-in-law, Elizabeth, had never liked her for her beloved son, and the grieving woman now utterly blamed her for Billy's violent death. Soon enough, Ann was facing a grand jury trial on charges of her own husband's murder. In the Nassau County courthouse, a pitiful-looking Ann testified to her innocence, asserting again that she had only thought Billy was a burglar. All the same, the prosecution brought up her marital issues and, no doubt, the hefty inheritance she might get if Billy wasn't around. Then, the verdict came back. After just 30 minutes of deliberation, the jury brought back its controversial choice. They acquitted Ann Woodward of all charges by determining that she had only acted in self-defense, and the courtroom likely went wild. In someone else's story, this happy ending might have led to Ann's renaissance, but no. Even though the official court proceedings had wrapped up, Ann wasn't exactly scot-free. It wasn't just that people didn't believe her innocence, they also believed Ann's mother-in-law Elizabeth had rigged the case, paying $400,000 to get Ann off the hook, and even bribing Paul Worths to make his confession about being the burglar. Sure enough, all of Ann's hard-earned friends turned their backs on her once more, and she fled to the continent to sip away her sorrows in Venice and elsewhere. Friends, however, weren't the only thing she lost. Throughout all of this, Ann still had two young boys, Woody and Jimmy, she was supposed to take care of. Only her mother-in-law also made sure that that was foreclosed to her too. After the shooting, Grandma Elizabeth packed the boys off to boarding school in Switzerland. Although Ann was now living a rootless life in continental Europe, she also made sure to enjoy the fact that she was single, by whatever means possible. People often saw her in the arms of younger men, including the male socialite Klaus von Bülow, who was over a decade her junior, and it was during one night with him that she ran headlong into her worst fate yet. In 1956, just a year after Billy's passing, Ann Woodward had taken up residence in the posh St. Moritz, Switzerland, with her new friend. While out dining, she ran into an old acquaintance, none other than the writer Truman Capote, who had so ruled New York with his swans during Ann's heyday. But Capote turned out to be no friend of Ann. Capote, who spent most of his New York career gossiping about women inside and around his circle, was very aware of Ann's fall from grace. Mischievous, haughty, and with a high opinion of himself, Capote reportedly loped over to Ann's table and interrupted her little chat with her younger man. Ann's response was vicious. Supposedly, an annoyed Ann called Capote a homophobic slur. Capote, who was gay, bit back even harder. In that moment, perhaps deciding she was guilty of offing her husband after all, Capote reportedly called Ann Mrs. Bang Bang. The nickname would stick, and so would Capote's grudge. To be fair, this report of Ann's meeting with Capote in St. Moritz is one-sided. That's because we know it primarily through Capote himself, who subsequently delighted in regaling everyone in his usual exaggerated and vicious style with the tale of how he put Mrs. Bang Bang in her place. Over the subsequent years, Ann tried to push herself back into New York high society, just as she'd done right after her marriage to Billy. This time, no one was buying it. She may have had the money now, but she had none of the power, and her looks were fading. Instead, she had to settle for the outskirts of influence even after she dared to move back to the city. The ongoing tragedy proved too much for one of the most important people in her life. Although Ann's sons, Woody and Jimmy, had been living mostly apart from her, first in boarding school and then living with her hated mother-in-law Elizabeth, they still meant the world to her. But while Woody seemed to be thriving from the outside, going to Harvard and then working as a journalist, Jimmy had already gone down a much darker path. After serving in Vietnam, Ann's youngest son came back a different person and a wrecked man. Jimmy had a substance addiction and was barely making it through life. Then one day, Ann got gut-wrenching news. In 1972, Jimmy had made an attempt on his own life by jumping from the 10th floor of his friend's apartment. Although he survived, he broke 10 bones in the process. In 1975, Ann Woodward was still picking up the pieces of her life and family when another complete bombshell hit. She got wind that her old acquaintance turned enemy, Truman Capote, was writing a thinly veiled exposé of the New York socialite world, and that the worst night of her life and the ensuing trial would appear in it, no doubt with very little empathy from Capote. She was shocked, but it was worse than she could have ever imagined. La Côte Basque was a chapter from Capote's full book Answered Prayers and proved itself beyond vicious when it appeared in the November 1975 issue of Esquire. In the excerpt, a woman relates to a Capote stand-in all about Ann Hopkins, who was a jazzy little carrot-top killer, and a malicious Betty Grable, who had killed her husband to make sure she got his money. And Capote didn't stop there. In La Côte Basque, Capote was essentially alleging that Anne was guilty of Billy's death, and made sure to deal her a few choice insults on top of that. Before La Côte Basque, Truman Capote was still in touch with his swans. Afterward, he all but ruined his professional and social career. One of the most influential swans, Babe Paley, completely cut Capote out of her life as a result of the publication, and led the charge in completely ostracizing him, just as Anne had experienced. Anne never actually got to see the publication of La Côte Basque in Esquire. By then she had already surrendered to her tragic fate. It appears the upcoming publication of Capote's second-hand dirty laundry was too much for her to handle, and in October 1975 she took a single cyanide pill and ended her life. Yet, as so often happened with Anne, her own tragedy rippled outward. In death, Anne got little redemption, even after Truman Capote's disgrace. Upon hearing of Anne's desperate actions, her mother-in-law Elizabeth merely stated, "She shot my son, and Truman just murdered her, and so now I suppose we don't have to worry about that anymore." Anne's son Jimmy had been troubled ever since his return from Vietnam, and the violent passing of his mother after his father seemed to break him completely. In September 1978, less than 3 years after Anne went, Jimmy leapt from the Mayfair Hotel in Manhattan and joined his mother at just 30 years old. Throughout all this, Anne's eldest son Woody had seemed remarkably normal and upstanding. The well-groomed young man took up politics around the 1980s and married Lisa Schreiber in 1985 in a ceremony in Paris. It looked as though he was going to follow his paternal family into New York respectability. If only. Anne was gone, but her memory and curse lived on. In 1994, her son Woody began to experience serious mental illness, with his wife Lisa filing court papers that stated he would often sleep on park benches and speak in tongues. "I don't want to use the word crazy," Lisa's lawyer said at the time, but there were episodes. There was also other all too familiar behaviour. In addition to Woody's mental health episodes, he also turned into a compulsive philanderer, much like both of his parents. In a cruel twist, he also reportedly taunted his wife Lisa by leaving love notes from his various affair partners, and sometimes even leaving evidence around that he'd been with someone else. Then came the nail in the coffin. In 1999, the final act in Ann Woodward's tragedy came at last. That year, her eldest son William Woodward III also took his own life, bringing the illustrious and doomed family line to an end. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos.